Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea, and I am one of your hosts for today's episode of the Ethical Brand Podcast.
And I'm your second host, Valentina, the creator of the Ethical Brand Studio.
Today, we're discussing one of the most pressing and misunderstood topics in ethical branding and communication, greenwashing. In an age where sustainability sells, many brands are tempted to overstate their environmental claims. But is it always intentional?
Great. So let's dive right in. We are talking about greenwashing today. So let's start with the basics. What is greenwashing?
Greenwashing is understood as the intent of a brand to make themselves look green while they're not really using sustainable practices and being ethical. So that's the common understanding of what greenwashing is. But this also leaves room for more discussion on when is a brand actually using sustainable practices and when not, and when can we say a brand is green and when not. Because nowadays it's really hard to make sure that all of your practices are actually green.
So then how do we distinguish between like intentional greenwashing and when it happens accidentally?
That's a great question. I believe intentional greenwashing is when the actual purpose behind a brand's mission, vision, and values is not aligned to being green, right? So when the reason why you're trying to make your brand look green is just to take advantage of the fact that people now care about that, but the core of your business is not truly ethical or conscious or trying to be green, right? And I would define unintentional or falling into greenwashing without actually wanting to when brands do want to do good with their business and with their product or services, are not fully able to have all of their processes being green, but still make it look as they are fully green, just because they're using some type of words. They're describing themselves using words that are very generic. And then what usually happens is that a brand that is trying to do good does something wrong in their processes, but they're defining themselves as ethical or green. And then people realize that they have this mistake, and then they call them out, and then they accuse them of doing greenwashing. And that's something that it's, in my opinion, it's sad because maybe that brand is actually putting a lot of more effort than maybe other brands, but still it's being called out and still it's having issue because of how they are talking about their efforts.
Okay. So then let's go back a little bit and let's talk first about what exactly does it mean to be a green brand?
In my opinion, everything starts with the intention of the brand in their core, in their mission. Why was the company created? What they're trying to get from the beginning, right? From the very start, from the very core. So to give you an example, if you are a fast fashion brand, like one of the biggest example we see of greenwashing, if your core operations or like the core way you function is fast fashion, there's very little ways to talk about being green and being ethical. It's true that sometimes these brands, because the society in general is putting more attention to this, to ethical or conscious consumption, sometimes they do create like some capsule collections or some type of separate product that could be more green. And I can't avoid saying more ethical because, like I'm saying, if in the core the brand is not ethical, it's very hard.
And for those of you that are listening and not watching, she's using air quotes around more ethical.
That's when it gets confusing, right? Then that's when we're wondering, like, is this greenwashing or not? Because even if the whole collection it's done with more conscious practices, if the main core of the business and the brand is not that, then it looks like greenwashing because that brand is trying to associate themselves with this value while the brand doesn't have those value at the core. So for example, I was talking about using generic words before. Green is a huge generic word, and it's a word we use to try to define this new type of consumption and type of businesses we want to create in the world, the people who actually have values that align to that. But it doesn't really say anything. There's nothing more vague than saying something is green. We're using a color to define something, right? So that's the issue around this topic, right? What does it mean to be green? What does it mean to be ethical? What does it mean to be conscious? When we're trying to talk about like a generic concept, but then it's very important for brands to go deeper and don't describe themselves as green, conscious, or ethical without being specific on how they are being green, conscious, or ethical. It's a little bit what we're doing here, right? For the studio, we're trying to show what we understand for these type of words. And that's what I'm suggesting brands to do with their brands. So if you're describing your brand as an ethical brand, it's important to explain to your audience what you mean by that, because it's too generic as a word. So for some brands, it could mean that their carbon emissions are lower, that they don't use some type of chemicals that are endangering the environment, that they take more care in using less plastic or in using less non-renewable energies. There's so many things you can be doing to try to become more green, ethical, and conscious. And there's different degrees. So how can I explain this? Imagine you create whatever, beauty product, let's say, and you have a brand that is trying to be ethical and conscious and sustainable in the beauty industry. There are so many degrees you can try to get to. So it can start with the chemicals that you use in your products. Then you need to look at the packaging. But then you also need to look at not only the processes you do, but also the ingredients you buy, where they come from, and what has happened before they arrive to you. Then not only that, your shipping, how is like your logistics? How much ChatGPT are you using for creating your marketing campaigns? Because there's so many steps in creating a business, so many processes that you need to make sure they are green. And then we can go back to what I said before, that it's almost impossible to be fully green, because it's even what car do I take to go to work? And is that a part of how I make my business?
The reason I wanted to dive into like green specifically is because I know that you might have companies that treat their employees really great. They have all the benefits and they really boast about being ethical and treating their employees right. But then maybe they're like exploiting the earth and not being like environmentally sustainable. That's why I wanted to distinguish between just like ethical in general, like what, because that can be so many things, and like green specific.
Can I stop you for a second? Because I think you touched on a very important point. The difference between being green or being ethical in the way you are describing it. Because it's so hard to touch on all the points. I think it's a great and very valuable start point to say, I'm going to focus on being ethical in the sense that I'm going to really take care of my employees. And I'm going to have an impact on how I treat my employees, how I treat my clients, how I communicate with my client, and trying to be very loving and try to create better relationships. I see that as a great thing. And maybe your processes are not green because you haven't managed to do that, or maybe it's not even one of your main purposes. So in my opinion, if you have a brand like, make sure that every time you use the word ethical or conscious, I'm trying to be careful with my words, because I know a lot of time with marketing, you do need a one sentence description of your brand. In many places, everybody talks about the elevator pitch, the one sentence reason why, So sometimes you need, and we in the studio too, the studio is called the Ethical Brand Studio. So I'm not, every time I use the word, putting a tagline, this is what I mean by ethical, it's not possible. But we do put a lot of effort into explaining what we mean by that, just to make sure that my audience understands what we mean, and I'm trying to be transparent, right, with what we're doing. So that's the thing. That's your main focus. Go with that and make sure that you try to be clear on what you mean when you say you're trying to be ethical or your business is ethical. And then another thing I wanted to touch on from what you said is there is another concept that is called triple impact businesses.
Right.
That it's more specific on that. So for example, if you want to say that you are focusing on all concepts, so triple impact is impact on the environment, on society, and on the economy, because you have a business, you want to have also an economical impact. And that's a concept that it's as you actually have to have an impact on those three things. And I really like it because it's more about the impact you're trying to create than things you're not doing. Because in the things you're doing, it's be a mistake because of how the world runs nowadays. But if you are saying you're trying to get an impact into something, then we can test. Are you actually having an impact on that? Are you saying you're trying to have an impact on society? Can I check what's the impact you're offering us? So I think that's when the words needs to be used carefully and always come with more explanation behind it.
What does that look like in practice when it comes to a sustainability message?
Okay, so the most transparent a brand can be, I think the better the reputation that brand can build and the more loyal your clients will be. The full degree of transparency is show almost like what it's required from NGOs. So it's being transparent with all your numbers, with all the, not only economical numbers, but your impact numbers. And what are you actually doing to be more sustainable? What are you actually doing to be more conscious? What processes have you implemented? What pledges have you taken? Are you being consistent with that? Let's say I take a pledge of not working with clients who are from the fossil industry, fossil fuel. Let's say I take a pledge and I have a badge and we say we don't do that. And that's the way I'm trying to work conscious. Can I show my audience all my clients? Or is there a way I can show them that all the clients I work are not from that
industry?
Exactly. Or if I say I'm trying to reduce the plastic amount of the products I'm working on, how much have you reduced that from the year before? Every year, how much are you reducing it? And if there's a point where you cannot reduce it anymore, you can say we've reached the maximum amount of reducing plastic we can do, and we think it's a fair number. We think on the overall strategy we have, it's a very good point where we are standing. And now, since we are not being able to reduce plastic more, now we're going to try to reduce the logistics and the energy we're using for something. So explaining to your audience with numbers, with facts, what you're doing.
Right.
Sometimes for brands, it's very scary because then they have to admit their errors and their mistakes or the things where they're falling short. I think at the end of the day, your audience and your clients will value that more and will understand it's human to make mistakes than if you don't say anything.
But also it can expose the system, right? Because if the problem is that like the system is so integrated with these poor like methods of doing things, then it exposes that like, hey, we're trying our best, but we can't say what these other providers are doing, or we can't even look into it. And we've tried to look for other alternatives.
There's none.
It just doesn't exist. And I keep thinking about, did you ever watch the show The Good Place?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like it's impossible to get into the good place.
Exactly.
Nowadays.
Show is amazing. Yes.
So then the core principles behind this is basically to communicate everything that you're doing with integrity, right? This is what we're doing. This is what we're trying to do. And then sticking by that.
Exactly.
And making sure you're trying your best. And then when you do fall short, just explaining.
Also, because it's also very hard to be tracking all the numbers and showing everything. That's why I believe it's great for brands to start with their main mission and stick to that. Most people who really care about being green or ethical or doing things right, I would use the words doing things right, because then everybody has a degree on how that's right or not. But people who care, basically, they try to do everything right and they're scared of greenwashing or whatever else.
Right.
So for me, it's important to change this mindset and put the truth in front, taking that responsibility off needing to do everything right, but just create impact.
Yeah, because there's definitely an issue of like wanting perfection, right?
Yes.
You want perfection from your artists, you want perfection from your celebrities, you want perfection from your politicians, you want perfections from your businesses. And in reality, we can hold them accountable to a certain degree, but there is a reality that the world is so intertwined in a lot of bad methods of doing things. And I think especially if it's a small company, you let them try, like stick to a mission, do that mission. And the moment that you have the capacity to do better.
Exactly. Exactly. Because also you need to stay in business. That's one of the most important thing, in my opinion. Like if the research of being perfectly green in all your processes, perfectly right in all your processes, takes you away from being in business. If it's so
Right.
hard that then you're not able to have a business, then the positive impact you want to create will not longer be there. And so,
Right. It won't exist because
exactly.
you can't sustain yourself. Right. Okay. And then like the only people that end up winning are these companies that don't care.
Exactly.
And
Exactly my point.
And then we're just out of people that care trying to do business.
At the end of the day, we all need to consume. We all need to buy food. We all need to wash ourselves with products. We all need to live in some type of house.
Right. Have furniture to sleep on, clothes to wear on our bodies.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And then we want to create, which I love
Right.
of the human species, and to create, if you're an artist, you need materials. If you're a business person, you want to use softwares or other stuff. So it's very unlikely that we stop to consume, right? Or that we try to create a world where we are away from consumption. There will always be a degree of consumption of things in the best sense of the word. At the end of the day, you will always have an option of products and services to choose from. And that's where I believe that if you can offer something that is creating a greater impact than the other people that are there, even if it's not perfect, I value that you're there and that you don't go out of business, because you're still giving me something better than what exists. And I want more people like you than the other people in business.
Right. So let's touch a bit on certifications and whether brands should use them or not. And is it good for their messaging?
Yes. So certification, in my opinion, are a very good way to talk about what you're actually doing or the way you're actually trying to be more sustainable and conscious, because it kind of summarizes all that we talked before, right? So instead of me having to talk about all the things that I'm doing, I can have a certification that says, for me to have this certification, I'm doing all of that things. And then people can recognize them faster and better, right? Because also from the consumer viewpoint, it's so hard to make sure and check that all the brands that you're consuming from are ethical or that they follow your values. For example, here in Europe, we have the bio certification, right?
Okay. And then so for our US audience, the bio certification in Europe just is basically just like the organic logo in the United States. But of course, they're two different entities, so they have different rules and regulations on how they control that.
Which is funny if you think about it, because how is it possible that we need two different names in two different countries? That makes you understand very quickly that there's so many regulation and ways to understand or to measure what you're doing, that, like we said before, where all the gray areas come into place. But what I'm really familiar with is the European one, the bio one. And for example, there is a big issue with that certification, which is that not all, so bio should mean that your products have a very, very small percentage of contamination from chemicals, right? And to achieve that, the farmers cannot use chemicals on the soil and on their crops. What happens is that the farmer will not use those products, but then when they go and test the results of the crop to make sure they can be sold as bio, what happens is that just by transporting them, they start becoming contaminated. And then they don't actually able to still stand by the certification.
Why does the transportation process affect that?
It's very hard to find a bubble, right? So you're farming next to other agriculture places.
So if they spray, the wind might catch it and get on yours.
Or while being transported, the contamination of the streets can then result in negative laboratory tests. For example, one super negative thing about this label is that to be able to have that super clean product, you also need to be farming on a soil that it's not been used with products in a very long time. So that takes to deforestation, because most of the soils have been used before. You need to leave a soil without usage for way too much time, and then people don't want to go through that, right? So there is a lot of bad stuff that happen to try to achieve that certification. And then when you do it and you go and test them, you might not come out with a product that actually meets that certification. So that certification at one point is way too strict for people to actually be able to meet the requirements.
And I'm sure it's expensive as well.
It's super expensive. It's super expensive. And what people really care about is that you don't put pesticides on their product. What ends up happening is that people in their product, they sell the products without meeting the requirement anyway, because they are allowed to do so. Meaning the certification is given to the business. So once you get certified, you can sell products with that certification, but then the products might not actually meet the certification. Like it's not, you don't get the certification by all your products being tested.
And then I'm sure they're not tested all the time, because then that's unsustainable.
And then people who are really trying to fit the certification kind of fall out of business because the bigger ones don't really care, and they're selling these crops that are contaminated somehow because the label allows you to do it anyways. So why am I bringing this up? Because all these issues behind the bio label make it so that people start not trusting the label and seeing the label as a bad thing because it takes businesses into all these negative practices. So just the label and the product can be more expensive without actually being as clean as it should be. So this brings a huge debate, and it makes things complicated even more than what they are. But what I believe is that because they know how much most of the businesses have to go through to get that label, if you're buying from a small business that has that label, even if it's not, especially small businesses, even if it's not as clean as it should be when tested, it's still so much better than any other product.
Right.
So in my opinion, at the end of the day, it's still worth it. And we should complain with the people who are making the certification so strict and so not trustable.
Right. Is it kind of like a situation like the Board of Education, right? Where it's like full of people that have never been teachers, and so they don't actually know what it requires? Is this what it's like?
It probably. Or what is the intention behind it? Who's profiting from this? I haven't done research so deeply.
But that's a good question to always ask. Like when you're reading an article, who wrote this article? Who's funding this article? Or if it's a scientific paper, who's funding the research? Who's writing?
Exactly.
Who's benefiting from what you're saying?
So as a consumer, it's good to do research on the certification, come to your own conclusions, like I did on bio certification, where I'm like, if the business is small, it's a small town, small business. For example, I went once to a small beer factory and I saw all their processes, and they put so much care into it, and they had the bio certification. For me, that is to show that if there's a small business and they have the certification, then there's high chances that that business is doing most things right, or at least a lot better than everyone else. You know, that's the conclusion I made. I'm not saying you need to make that same conclusions as me, but I do believe as a brand, the certification helps you, even if it's controversial in that example. Other certifications like B Corp are way more trusted. So that's one that I follow a lot. I always try to buy B Corp products when I have the option compared to the other products.
Amazing.
Most of the time, it doesn't make the products more expensive.
Oh, that's good.
So I don't really know how that works, but I mean, there's not such a huge difference as bio, not bio, or organic, not organic. Like in the States, I know it's a lot more expensive than not organic, right? With B Corp is not as much.
Okay.
There's recently been an issue with the B Corp certification. If I'm not mistaken, Nestle was able to get it, which we all know is not. Yes.
No.
So somehow with a cute group of lawyers, they were able to find a loophole into the certification and managed to get it. They've also made a lot of improvement, this we have to say, from how they were before. Still, I don't believe in their core. There is a good... Yes.
Yeah, okay. No, I'll never believe it. They're like on record.
Yes.
Like,
That's why, because in the core, we know it's not
Yeah.
true. And this is an amazing thing to talk about, because for me, the most important lesson behind everything, if at your core, you are trying to do things right, your mistakes will come across so much differently and people will be able to understand them, compared to if your core values are not those and you're trying to look like you're being green and then you make mistakes. People are gonna shout out and that and be like, no, it's not possible, like you could not possibly have a B Corp.
Yeah, that's quite upsetting.
And then I would say also about this, that depending on which category or which sector your brand is, you should be searching more about what labels are available. FSC for paper and wood, or other labels for different sectors. And then do research on the label. Make sure it's a trusted label.
Right. So there's always levels of things, right? Like
Exactly.
these certifications are a good starting point, but then there's always levels to like what they could actually be doing. Okay, so for our last question for today, what advice would you give a small business or a small brand that's doing the right things behind the scenes, but doesn't know how to talk about them without sounding like they're being performative, and they're really trying, but they don't know how to talk about it? What advice would you give?
Okay, maybe my answer will look like it goes on a whole different direction, but stay with me. So the biggest advice I can give people who are in that position is, first, to be fully sincere with themselves on what their values are and what they're trying to achieve as a company. So be sincere with themselves and decide on which impact you're actually going to commit, like which impact you want to try to bring to the world, that you are committed to bringing that to the world. Because most of the time, like we said, we're trying to do everything right, and then it's overwhelming, and then maybe some things I'm doing half right, and then I don't know how to say it without sounding that I'm not actually doing everything that I should do, and all of those things that we talked about. So first thing is to be very sincere and be like, okay, this is what I really want to commit to, and this I'm gonna make sure my business follows and that people can hold us accountable for these. It means you're putting yourself to the test, right? So this is something you need to be very clear with. And then from there, try to get a report of all the steps you're doing to get to that result, and try to communicate them the most transparently. And don't be afraid to say you did something wrong. Maybe you bought from a buyer that said that everything was right. You believed it. You didn't do enough research because life, right? Or you were doing research on other stuff, or you did whatever. And then you realize like a few months later, or somebody brings up, especially here, if somebody of your client, your audience brings up something that you didn't realize you were doing wrong, if you truly care, your reaction will be, oh my God, I didn't know that. I'm so sorry. I'm going to fix it. And that's the attitude I think brands should have, and how they should show up to their audience.
Right, because if you get defensive, that's almost like, we don't care. Like, shut up and let us do what we need to do.
What people need nowadays is to be able to trust someone, to be able to trust their brands. And trust doesn't necessarily comes from doing everything the way you say you do it, because we are human and we can make mistakes. So trust comes from taking responsibility. So if I made a mistake, I'm going to take responsibility and I'm going to fix it. That's so much more powerful than being broad on how you explain what you're doing. So just to make sure nobody can call you out, or being scared when someone calls you out and then you try to tell a different story or lie just to keep your brand perception. That's what I would do. First, make sure it's real, and then just take responsibility and be the most transparent you can.
Right. So, and then like start small, and then like don't try to be perfect in everything at the same time.
People know it's not possible. We as users, as consumer, are not able to be fully responsible with our consumption most of the time. So we know how hard it is. We can empathize. And if you're doing something that your target audience is conscious consumers, then they will understand. They know the struggle. They do research. They know about this. And that's the huge difference between appealing to the masses with a green packaging with leaves, or like this, like this bamboo paper, brown paper, which is
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking like beige,
Exactly.
and, like light greens,
Exactly.
mossy greens for packaging, but it's still
not.
yeah, it's just there for to be visually think that it's green, but it's not. Yeah.
Exactly. When you're trying to appeal to a trend, then you're going to do all of that. Use green packaging, use all of these colors and textures and all of these. And then maybe you're going to get people who don't really care because they don't do research. They don't actually look at the labels or
But they want to feel good about themselves, right?
Exactly. And that's greenwashing to come a full circle.
But it's full circle.
Yeah, it's like, it's both, at the end of the day, it's both greenwashing for the product or like the brand and for the people. Because it's like, oh, I want to be green, but I don't really know what I'm doing. And I want to be green because green is cool. And
Right.
but that's a different type of target. And if you really care, you're not trying to appeal to that target. And
Right.
also the trendsetters of the green revolution or the green trend are people who actually know what they are doing. So if you can conquer the hearts of those people, then the other ones will follow, even if they don't know why. That's how human society works.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I learned a lot. I love these talks.
Thank you, Andrea, for your beautiful questions and for the deepness of the conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Ethical Brand Podcast. If something we said sparked a thought or shifted your perspective, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on all socials at The Ethical Brand Studio or head to theethicalbrandstudio.com to learn more about how we support conscious brands, artists, and nonprofits. And if you're enjoying the podcast, one of the best ways to support us is by sharing with a friend or leaving a review on your favorite platform. It helps more people find us and keep these conversations going. Until next time.